The Silent Watchers. Our final account for tonight comes from a solo wilderness guide, a woman named Lena, who spent her entire adult life in the remote forests of British Columbia. She was a survivalist, an expert tracker, and had an almost spiritual connection to the wild, able to read the subtle signs of the forest as easily as others read a book. She had seen bears, cougars, even wolves, and respected them all, understanding their place in the ecosystem. But what she encountered one particular summer defied every rational explanation and left her deeply, irrevocably changed, her connection to the wild now tinged with a profound, unsettling fear. Lena was leading a 3-day, 2-night wilderness immersion trip with a small group of clients, teaching them basic survival skills and ethical wildlife observation. They were in a truly isolated area, miles from any roads, accessible only by a long trek or a float plane. The first day passed without incident. They set up camp in a remote clearing near a pristine alpine lake, the air crisp and clean, the silence profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of water and the distant calls of loons. On the second day, they were practicing tracking techniques, moving slowly and deliberately through a particularly dense section of old-growth forest. The clients were focused, learning to identify scat, disturbed earth, and broken twigs, completely absorbed in the lesson. Lena was leading, her senses highly attuned to the environment, her mind processing every subtle change in the air, every shift in the light. It started subtly, a feeling. Not a sound, not a sight, but a deep, pervasive sensation of being watched. Lena, being the experienced outdoors woman she was, initially dismissed it. Perhaps a deer or a curious bear, their eyes following the group from a distance. She paused, scanned the tree line, her gaze sweeping through the shadows, but saw nothing. The forest seemed utterly devoid of life, a stillness that was unusual even for this remote area. The ambient sounds of the forest, the distant buzzing of insects, the rustle of leaves under a gentle breeze, the gentle creaking of branches, the chirping of unseen birds, were muted, almost absent, as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over the world. She continued, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger, like a cold hand pressing against her back, a constant, unseen pressure. It wasn't the fleeting gaze of an animal. This felt different, more deliberate, more intelligent. It felt like multiple pairs of eyes, unseen, unmoving, but intensely focused on her and her group. A feeling of profound, focused observation, as if they were under a microscope. She stopped the group, quietly telling them to pay attention to their surroundings, her voice low and serious. They also felt it, a general sense of unease, a prickling on their skin, a sudden chill despite the warm day. One of the clients, a city dweller, nervously asked, "Is something watching us, Lena? I feel eyes." Lena tried to reassure them, but her own gut was churning with a growing dread. She pointed out a distant bird call, trying to create a sense of normalcy, but even that felt forced, hollow. The feeling of being watched was too strong, too persistent, too unnatural. It was like they had walked onto a stage and an unseen audience had taken their seats, their attention fixed on every movement, every whispered word. They continued their lesson, But Lena found herself constantly glancing into the deep shadows between the trees, straining her eyes, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing this profound sense of unease. She saw nothing but the endless ancient trees, their trunks rough and dark, their branches intertwined, creating a dense, almost impenetrable wall of green and brown, a living curtain hiding unseen eyes. Then she noticed something odd about the trees themselves. It wasn't every tree, but certain ones, particularly the very large, ancient ones, deep in the shadows, seemed darker. Not just darker from lack of light, but a deeper, absorbing blackness, as if they were drinking in the light. And their branches, at certain angles, seemed to twist in ways that were almost anatomical, like gnarled, skeletal arms reaching out, or bent, silent figures standing perfectly still, partially obscured by the foliage, their forms just on the edge of perception, shifting if she stared too long. She knew it was probably just pareidolia, the human brain finding patterns in randomness, but the feeling was so strong, so chilling, that it was hard to shake, and her rational mind struggled to maintain its grip. It continued for another hour, the feeling of being watched intensifying with every step, becoming almost suffocating. Lena began to feel a profound exhaustion, an almost physical drain on her energy, as if the very act of being observed was siphoning off her life force. Her steps grew heavy, her thoughts sluggish, her mind struggling to focus. The clients, too, looked pale and drawn, their usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet, nervous tension, their eyes darting nervously into the shadows. As they neared a small clearing for their lunch break, the feeling of being watched culminated. It wasn't just observing now, it felt like they were being studied, analyzed. Every breath, every movement, every fleeting glance, every nervous twitch. And then, from deep within the silent shadows of the trees surrounding the clearing, she heard it. Not a sound made by breathing or movement. It was a thought, not in English, not in any language she knew, but a distinct, non-verbal impression that echoed in her mind, clear as a bell, yet utterly alien. They are small, weak, fragile, ephemeral. The thought wasn't voiced, yet it was undeniably clear, chillingly clear, as if it had been placed directly into her consciousness, a cold, clinical assessment, devoid of emotion, yet profoundly disturbing. It wasn't accusatory, nor was it threatening in the human sense. It was simply a detached, superior observation, like a scientist studying ants or an ancient, timeless entity evaluating brief, insignificant lives. It was the realization that whatever was watching them wasn't just there. It was aware, intelligent, and saw them as utterly insignificant, fleeting blips in its eternal existence. Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond anything she had ever felt. A primal fear, deeper than any encounter with a predator. She looked at her clients. None of them reacted, still scanning the trees, oblivious to the mental intrusion. It was just for her. The thought was meant for her alone. A direct, cold, and utterly devastating communication. A message of profound cosmic indifference. At that moment, the subtle forms she had been seeing in the trees, the ones that looked like bent figures, the ones just on the edge of her perception, seemed to solidify for a terrifying fraction of a second. Not into clear, defined shapes, but into an undeniable presence. Tall, impossibly thin, almost two-dimensional against the dark bark, blending perfectly with the shadows, their forms like distortions in the very fabric of reality, a shimmering undefinition at the edges of vision. Their outlines were a blur of shadow and tree, yet their presence was undeniable, a cold weight in the air. And then they were gone, dissolving back into the dappled light and shadow, leaving only the oppressive feeling of their recent proximity. It was as if they had shown themselves to her, just for a moment, just enough for her to understand that they were real, and they were everywhere. An omnipresent, silent judgment. Lena forced herself to breathe, to push down the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She needed to get her clients out, now. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it felt like a stranger's, strained and thin. "New plan. We're heading back to camp. We're cutting this session short." One of the clients, a young man, frowned. "But Lena, we haven't even had lunch, and we're still miles from camp." "I know," Lena replied, her eyes sweeping the tree line, a desperate urgency in her movements. "But the air pressure is dropping rapidly. I think a major storm front is moving in faster than anticipated. We need to get back to the tents before it hits, now." She didn't wait for questions, didn't offer further explanations, just turned and started moving at a brisk, purposeful pace, not quite running, but close to it, urging the group to follow, her eyes darting between the trees, every nerve screaming, every shadow a potential observer. They walked quickly, the feeling of being watched never dissipating, if anything, intensifying with every step. Lena didn't look back, didn't dare to. She could feel the eyes on her, on them, a lingering, silent observation, almost a silent dismissal, as if their departure was merely an expected conclusion. The forest around them felt like a massive, open maw, and they were the insignificant morsels within it, being silently scrutinized by something ancient and patient. Something that had witnessed countless such fleeting lives pass through its domain. They finally reached their camp just before dusk, breathless and rattled. The clients, relieved to be back in the relative safety of their tents, attributed their unease to Lena's warning about the storm and their own inexperience. But Lena knew there was no storm. The sky was perfectly clear, a vast, indifferent expanse above the silent, watching trees. That night, Lena didn't sleep. She sat by the campfire, watching the darkness, the feeling of being observed so strong it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her. A cold, invisible presence just beyond the firelight. She saw nothing, heard nothing, but she knew. They were still there, the silent watchers. They hadn't left. They were merely observing from a distance, satisfied with their message, their assessment, content to let the cold dread settle deep within her. The next morning, she woke her clients early, packed up camp in record time, and guided them out of the forest with a relentless, almost desperate pace. The feeling of being watched began to lessen only after they had put several miles behind them, replaced by a lingering, cold dread that burrowed deep into her soul, a permanent scar on her psyche. Lena still works as a wilderness guide, but she never takes clients to that specific area again. And she never feels truly at peace in the deep woods anymore. That pristine wilderness, once her sanctuary, now feels like a place where she is always an intruder, always being watched, always being judged by silent ancient eyes. She knows that we are not alone in those ancient forests. There are other beings, other intelligences that dwell within them, creatures that predate us, that move silently through the shadows, watching, waiting, sometimes communicating, but always making it clear that we are, to them, merely passing, ephemeral things. And once you know that, truly know it, you can never look at the woods the same way again. The silence is never truly silent. It is merely waiting.